Let's bring in our political panel, attorney and Democratic strategist Michelle Thomas. Also with us, radio host and investigative columnist at the Daily Signal, Tony Kinnett. Both of you, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. So many Americans don't know where Kamala Harris stands on certain issues, and she has been accused of flip-flopping in previous stances. For example, in yesterday's interview, she explicitly said that she will not ban fracking. That is a direct departure from her stance in 2019, where she in fact said in a CNN town hall, quote, "There is no question I'm in favor of banning fracking," on her first day in office. Michelle, let's start with you. Do you think Harris did enough here to squash these criticisms?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. She absolutely did, because I think that the term flip-flopping doesn't actually apply here. What we've seen from Kamala Harris is an evolution of her policies, an evolution of the way that she's approaching these various issues. And I think that that's very common. As you've had more experience, more information, your position should change and evolve. So remember, she's now sat for 3.5 years as vice president. She's worked directly on these issues, and she's acquired a lot more information and experience. And so it makes perfect sense that her position has evolved to be more inclusive, and that she's rethought that. So I think it's actually an indicator of progress. And that's what the American people need. They need a new path forward, as she said, and progress along these very critical issues.
Okay, so let's talk about the talking points now. It looks as though the Democratic National Committee is focusing on calling this an evolution. Following a tradition, though, of presidents bringing on or retaining politicians from across the aisle, Harris also indicated her intention to appoint a Republican to her cabinet. Of course, Donald Trump is already reaching across the aisle, bringing in RFK Jr., also Tulsi Gabbard. She joined him on the campaign trail last night, in fact. So, Tony, how is this playing with Republicans in particular?
So far, we don't actually have any evidence that Kamala's flip-flops on policies are making any kind of substantive, really a substantive move to actually secure Republican votes in swing states towards what she's really trying to provide, at least as far as the national stage is concerned. I don't really think that we're seeing a lot of warm feelings towards some kind of a Republican appointment that wouldn't be what many would consider a Republican that kind of like an Adam Kinzinger or someone like Liz Cheney, someone who's not really friendly with a lot of Republicans, at least in the broader American South, the Midwest. I'm not really expecting, at least at this point, that this is going to register with voters that the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz campaign is making inroads towards producing effective policy for Americans. This really feels more like a reflexive reaction to Trump being endorsed by Gabbard and RFK Jr. instead of making substantive policy decisions of her own.
Well, the question always posed to presidential candidates, what would you do on day one in office? Here's what Kamala Harris had to say to that one.
Well, there are a number of things. I will tell you, first and foremost, one of my highest priorities is to do what we can to support and strengthen the middle class. When I look at the aspirations, the goals, the ambitions of the American people, I think that people are ready for a new way forward, in a way that generations of Americans have been fueled by hope and by optimism.
So hope and optimism, these are words that we were hearing on the heels of the DNC, but so far no real specific policy plans, just kind of overreaching ideas. I want to get each of your takes on that answer. Michelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the problem here is that while last night she did not go into great detail during this joint interview with herself and Walz, she has, in many of her campaign speeches, many of her rallies, laid out a very specific, what she's calling an economic opportunity agenda. That includes infusing the housing market, making housing more affordable, providing $25,000 to first-time buyers of new homes, to using federal funds to create 3 million new units of housing. She's talked about capping prescription medication. Certainly, we already have the insulin cap, but she's talked about capping the prescription medication costs for the top 10 most popular and needed medications in this country. She's talked about certainly reproductive rights. So she has laid out a very clear plan in many of her campaign speeches. And so just because she didn't do so last night in great detail doesn't mean she doesn't have a plan. And so I think that cannot be overlooked. And again, what she's laid out is a stark contrast between her hope and optimism that she's infused into this country through her campaign versus a candidate who is obsessed seemingly about himself. And when you talk about flip-flopping, I think this week we saw that Trump has suddenly become a pro-choicer. And so that is a significant departure from his prior alleged policies. And one of the differences is he had 4 years, so we can look at his history and record. Here, Kamala Harris, this would be her first time, certainly in the White House, as the lead, as the commander in chief. And she's laid out a clear roadmap and plan on how she plans to make just living for everyday Americans more affordable. And so that's what I think the people are responding to. That's why you have hundreds of millions of dollars being raised and just great enthusiasm surrounding her campaign.
You know, Tony, it's interesting because when we talk about the plans, and thank you, Michelle, for laying those things out, I think the big question that a lot of voters are asking is, how is she going to implement these plans that are essentially just ideas? We do know that the tie-breaking vote that ushered in the economic downfall and the inflation that so many families are feeling right now, that tie-breaking vote was cast by Kamala Harris. So, Tony, what do you think about how this is being portrayed right now, especially in the media and from the candidates?
Well, from the candidates, at least from the Harris campaign, it's being promoted as exactly as my counterpart stated, as some kind of bold, new, hopeful strategy of really good feelings. Unfortunately, though, there are no specifics to any of those plans. It's boiled down to give people money, at least as far as pumping money into the economy via running the money printer as quick as you can over at the Fed, like she did when she cast the tie-breaking vote, and basically continuing the Biden-Harris policies, of which this is not going to be day one. We're on day 1,315 or something like that at this point, of Harris having a major impact, which she's been bragging about the entire term that we all just spent the last 4 years living through. As far as voters are concerned, I don't believe we're seeing any bold, new, modern approaches to the White House. That's why she didn't provide Dana Bash with any answers on the CNN interview. She stated very clearly that she just had these broad, basic ideas for the Midwest and for the middle class and for Americans in general. And none of those ideas really had any substance to them. That's why she didn't list any of those in detail. She talks about a housing plan. No one really has any idea how she's going to accomplish this. She talks about a prescription drug cap. She can't just write these executive orders by fiat until she gets her way. We have yet to see a substantive claim from her campaign. And I think the Trump campaign, in kind of in the opposite, has made a pretty decent move towards pointing that out, but obviously not clearly enough yet to force the other side of the campaign to do anything substantive in response.
Well, a lot of questions that voters are going to be demanding answers to on both sides. Michelle Thomas, Tony Kinnett, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Great conversation.
Yes,
thanks for having us.
Yes.